I am Dr. Helena Ward, 58 years old, a retired forensic pathologist living in a small lakeside town in Michigan. For 3 decades, I've carried fresh lilies to the same grave every first Sunday of June. My husband, Ethan Ward, a marine engineer, was declared dead after an explosion aboard the Aurora vessel 30 years ago. They never found his body. The only thing recovered was his silver watch, engraved with E.W., which I buried with my own hands. That grave became my altar of loyalty. This morning, the cemetery office called. They're relocating part of the land to make room for new plots. I was asked to verify the contents before the move. A standard procedure, they said. I agreed without thinking much. You don't expect surprises from the dead. The wind was sharp when I arrived, slicing across the empty field like the edge of a scalpel. The caretaker, a quiet man in a faded green jacket, nodded at me before lifting the tombstone with the help of 2 workers. The sound of metal scraping stone echoed, a harsh kirk that made my stomach twist. "Mrs. Ward, you may want to sit down," the supervisor murmured, lowering his mask. "Right," I said. "I've handled autopsies for 25 years. I can look." That was a lie. When the lid creaked open, I saw nothing. No bones, no remains, just an empty space lined with rotting silk. My throat tightened. The scent of damp wood and rust filled the air. I bent closer, half hoping I'd missed something. Anything human. But all I found was a small linen pouch tucked into the corner. Inside, resting on a bed of dust, was a rusted key. Its teeth were worn smooth, its handle shaped like a ship's wheel. I touched it, and my hand started trembling before I even realized it. The key was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been waiting for me all this time. "Are you sure this is the right grave?" I asked, my voice thin. "Yes, ma'am." Section 4B, Plot 127. Nameplate says Ethan Ward, 1962-1995. Everything matches. Everything except the man inside. The silence that followed was heavier than grief. 30 years of mourning suddenly felt like a bad experiment, one I'd miscalculated from the start. I stared at the hollow coffin and saw my own reflection on the inner lid, distorted by tears I didn't remember shedding. If this grave was empty, then where had Ethan been all these years? The caretaker cleared his throat, waiting for me to sign the relocation form. His voice sounded far away. I signed without looking, my hand shaking so hard the pen left scratches instead of letters. As I turned to leave, the wind slammed the lid shut with a dull thud. It sounded almost like laughter. "Mrs. Ward, are you all right?" "Yes," I lied again. "I just need a moment." I walked toward the car, the pouch clutched in my fist. The key pressed into my palm, drawing a thin line of pain that felt more real than anything else around me. For 30 years, I believed I'd buried my husband. Now I wasn't sure who I'd been mourning. I met Ethan Ward in the spring of 1988. He was a foreign graduate student at the university. Brilliant, a little too charming for his own good. And I was a lab assistant in the Department of Forensic Pathology. I remember the first time he walked into the pathology lab. A man in a navy blue jacket, hair still damp from the rain, asking for directions to the engineering building. Most men flinched at the smell of formalin and cold steel tables. Ethan didn't. He looked around as if he'd stepped into a cathedral. "You work here?" he asked, his voice smooth, accented in a way I couldn't place. "Yes. I study the dead so the living can sleep better," I replied, expecting him to laugh. He didn't. Instead, he smiled. "Then you're doing holy work, doctor?" "Not a doctor yet, just Helena." He extended a hand. Clean, soft, manicured. Not the hands of a man who built things, but of someone who observed them. It struck me then how clean they were. Too clean for an engineer. We met again 2 days later in the campus cafe. He was hunched over blueprints, muttering equations. Grading reports. He asked if he could share my table, and that was how it began, slowly, deliberately, like a careful autopsy where you peel away each layer to find what lies beneath. Ethan had a way of making ordinary moments feel deliberate. He took me sailing on Lake Michigan in a rented boat, though he could barely steer. He cooked pasta but forgot the salt. Yet he'd look at me afterward and say, "Someday, when my project is done, we'll have a house by the water. You won't have to live among the dead anymore." I laughed, but I believed him. That was my first mistake. We married a year later, in a small wooden chapel near campus. The wedding cost exactly $472. I remember the number because I worked both night shifts that week to afford it. My colleagues joked that I'd married the only engineer who didn't know how to fix a faucet. They were right. Ethan wasn't the type to fix things, he was the type to hide them behind beautiful words. He said he was developing a magnetic propulsion system for long-distance vessels. It sounded futuristic, noble, almost impossible. He said once it worked, we'd be free from morgues, from night shifts, from grief. So I waited. When I got pregnant with Lucas, Ethan spent months at a naval research facility upstate. Letters came sporadically, short, formal, sometimes without dates. "All going well," he'd write. Soon turned into years. I returned to the lab after Lucas was born, juggling diapers and autopsy reports. I worked 2 jobs, daytime at the hospital, nights in the coroner's office. Ethan sent checks but rarely visited. "You're married to a dreamer," my supervisor once told me. "No," I said. "I'm married to a man who will change the world." That was my second mistake. The explosion happened on a Sunday. Aurora, the ship Ethan helped design, reportedly caught fire during a propulsion test. 12 crew members were declared dead. Only fragments of wreckage were found. I remember answering the door that morning, Lucas clinging to my leg, as 2 men in Navy uniforms handed me a small box. Inside lay Ethan's silver watch, still ticking, miraculously. And a folded letter of condolence. I asked if they'd found a body. They said no, but the sea keeps its secrets. I signed the papers, arranged a memorial, and buried the watch in a coffin lined with white silk. I spent $1,300 money I didn't have to make sure his grave looked peaceful. People in town said it was a lovely service. Every month, on the same day, I brought white lilies. I talked to him like he was still listening. I told him about Lucas's grades, my insomnia, the new freezer in the morgue that wouldn't shut properly. Grief became a routine, a ritual I performed with surgical precision. There was one thing Ethan had said before he left for that final trip. It was the last conversation we ever had, at least, the last one I thought we'd had. He handed me a small brass key attached to a red ribbon. "Keep this," he said. "It's for our secret room." "What room?" I asked, laughing. "It'll go one day." I thought it was a romantic gesture. A symbol, like the way poets talk about keys and hearts. I put it away in a jewelry box and forgot about it. Years later, when Lucas was 10, I looked for it and couldn't find it anymore. I assumed I'd misplaced it during one of our many moves. Time eroded grief into habit. Lucas grew up, joined the Navy, and left home. I retired early, bought a cottage near the lake, and filled my days with predictable silence. Every June, I still went to the cemetery. Every year, the lilies wilted faster. Once when I was there, an old man approached me. A groundskeeper I'd never met. "You come here often," he said kindly. He was my husband. "We get many wives here. Not all graves get flowers for 30 years. He must have been a good man. I smiled, though I wasn't sure anymore what good meant. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, I wondered why the Navy never returned Ethan's personal items, his papers, his ring, his clothes. They said everything had burned, but I'd seen photographs of the wreckage. Some parts of the ship looked untouched. Still, I never questioned it, maybe because questioning meant reopening the wound. When Lucas married, I gave him Ethan's watch. He wore it for a while, then kept it in a drawer. "It'll's wrong," he said. I didn't ask why. Maybe he felt, as I did, that the ticking sound wasn't quite steady, as if time itself was hesitating between life and death. On the 30th anniversary of the explosion, I wrote in my journal, "A decade's gone, I am finally at peace." 2 weeks later, the cemetery called. Now that I think about it, the signs had been there all along. Tiny irregularities I brushed aside. the letters without postmarks, the checks from an account that wasn't in his name, the way Lucas avoided talking about the Navy as if protecting a secret that wasn't his. Maybe I didn't want to know. Maybe. Deep down, I feared that Ethan hadn't died enough. Because if he had truly died, then why did I keep dreaming of him standing at the foot of my bed, hands clean, smiling, saying, "Helena, don't open the door yet." I used to wake up sweating, the taste of salt water in my mouth. It was grief. Now, I think it was memory. Something my body knew before my mind dared to admit. The grave was never just a grave. It was the one place I felt safe to miss him without looking foolish. And that key, the one he said was for our secret room. I thought it was a metaphor for intimacy, for trust. But now, holding the rusted key found inside the empty coffin, I can't help but wonder, was it the same one? Or was this a message he left behind, waiting for me to finally dig him up? Not from the earth, but from the lie he built around us. If I close my eyes, I can still see him on that last morning before the explosion, tying the red ribbon around the key and saying, "One day, this will unlock everything." At the time, I thought he meant love. Now, I realize he meant truth. Lucas was 10 when he asked me the kind of question no mother ever rehearses for. "Mom," he said one night while we were folding laundry, "if Dad ever came back, would you still recognize him?" The house was silent except for the hum of the dryer. Outside, winter pressed its cold face against the windows. He was small then. Thin wrists, hair sticking up like his father's. I smiled, because I didn't know how else to answer. Of course I would. I'd know your father anywhere. How? I hesitated. The truth was, I didn't know anymore what his face really looked like. The photos had faded, the features in my mind had blurred into kindness. But I said the first thing that came to me. I'd recognize his hands. Your father's hands never had a trace of oil on them. Lucas frowned, turning the thought over like a puzzle piece. But you said he worked with engines. He did. Then how come his hands were always clean? I laughed to hide the sting. He was careful. He didn't like mess. Lucas accepted that answer, the way children do when they sense the conversation has reached a locked door. But that night, after he fell asleep, I couldn't stop staring at my own palms cracked from disinfectant, nails trimmed short, veins raised from years of work. They looked older than the rest of me. Ethan's hands, though, they were never tired. Always soft, always immaculate. Even when he came home from the shipyard, his cuffs were pressed, his skin unmarked. At the time, I thought it was pride. Now I wonder what he was really doing when he claimed to be working late. I still keep a photograph from that year. Lucas and I are standing by the lake, both bundled in scarves. Behind us, the water looks like glass, and you can almost see the outline of the shipyard across the bay. Ethan took the photo. Or, at least, that's what I used to believe. There's a shadow in the frame, tall and blurred, as if he'd moved too fast for the camera to catch. Sometimes I look at that photo and think, maybe he was never there at all. Maybe I took it myself and convinced my memory to lie. There was another moment, months after the explosion, when Lucas brought home a drawing from school. It showed 3 stick figures, me, him, and a man holding a suitcase. Over the man's head, he'd written, "Dad's trip." "That's lovely," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Is Dad coming home from his trip?" "Oh," he said simply, "he's just not done yet." I remember the way he said it. Calm, certain, like a fact he somehow already knew. When Lucas turned 11, I gave him Ethan's old compass, the one engraved with a map of constellations. It had stopped working years ago, the needle forever pointing north even when you turned it upside down. "It's broken," Lucas said. "No," I told him, "it's faithful. That's different." He didn't believe me, and neither did I. Looking back now, that night in the laundry room feels like a tiny crack in the glass, a moment when the truth could have slipped through, if I dared to look. Clean hands. That was the detail that undid me decades later, standing over his empty coffin. Because only someone who'd never touched machinery could keep them that way. The image of those hands haunts me more than his absence. I can still feel them sometimes, cool, careful, guiding mine as he taught me how to fold a paper boat for Lucas. We set it afloat on the lake. It sank in seconds, but he smiled and said, "That's all right. Even sinking things have their purpose." I didn't understand what he meant then. Now I do. I used to think love was about remembering, but maybe it's about noticing the tiny inconsistencies we choose to ignore because we're afraid they'll rewrite the story. Lucas was 10 when he asked if I'd recognize his father. I said yes. Now, I'm not so sure. Because if Ethan walked through my door today, I might see his face and feel nothing. But if I saw those clean hands, I think I'd still tremble. 2 months before the exhumation, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line. No signature. Just one sentence. Don't trust what's buried under his name. Open the grave before someone else does. At first, I thought it was spam. Another scam preying on widows. But the message was too precise, too cold, to be random. It mentioned his name, not my husband. And that tiny shift in language unsettled me. I deleted it, of course. Years in forensic work had made me skeptical by habit. I'd seen enough hoaxes to know grief can make people gullible. Still, the words lodged somewhere behind my ribs, like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. The next Sunday, I brought my usual bouquet of white lilies to the cemetery. I'd always chosen lilies because Ethan once said they reminded him of clean waves breaking on the shore. But when I reached the grave, someone had already been there. The vase was full of red roses, fresh, their petals slick with dew. I stood there confused. No one in town visited that grave except me. The caretaker passed by, tipping his cap. "Morning, Mrs. Ward. Looks like someone beat you to it today." "Did you see who?" "Can't say I did. Came early, maybe yesterday. The roses smelled sharp and metallic. They didn't belong there. I removed them, replaced them with my lilies, and tried to laugh it off. Maybe some stranger had made a mistake. Grays got mixed up all the time. But a week later, it happened again. The lilies gone, the roses back. That second time, I noticed something else. The soil near the headstone looked disturbed, as if someone had knelt there, pressed their hands into the earth. The indentations were small, neat, deliberate. I told myself not to be paranoid. The rational part of me listed possibilities. Teenagers, the wind, an animal. The part of me that used to cut open cadavers, though, recognized the unmistakable order of human intention. It felt like someone was sending me a message. But what kind of message hides itself in flowers? I started checking the grave at odd hours. Midday, dusk, even before sunrise. Each time, the pattern was the same. If I brought lilies, by the next morning they'd be replaced with roses. Once, at dawn, I caught sight of a figure leaving the cemetery. A man in a long coat, walking fast, head down. Too far away to recognize. But something about his gait measured, precise, froze me where I stood. Ethan used to walk that way, counting his steps unconsciously, as if rhythm were a kind of math. I almost called out his name. Then I stopped, feeling ridiculous. The dead don't walk. At least, they're not supposed to. That night, I searched my old files, trying to trace the email. The address was encrypted, routed through layers of proxies. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. I told Lucas about it over dinner. "It's probably some creep trying to get attention," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "They mentioned your father's name. Mom, it's been 30 years. People write books, blogs. Maybe it's just curiosity. No one curious sends flowers." He sighed, setting down his fork. "Please, don't start chasing ghosts. Dad's gone. You need to stop letting strangers make you reopen the wound." I wanted to argue, but the way he said "Dad's gone" sounded rehearsed, like a line he practiced too many times. The next morning, I found an envelope slid under my door. Inside was a photograph, grainy black and white. It showed a stretch of water, a shipyard, and a shadow of a man standing beside a vessel. The handwriting on the back read, "He's closer than you think." There was no return address. I took it to the police. They logged it, asked routine questions, promised to keep an eye out. But their tone said They'd already decided it was the work of a crank. When I got home, I placed the photo in my desk drawer next to Ethan's old compass. The compass needle quivered for a moment, then steadied, pointing north as always. I don't know why, but the air felt colder after that. One evening, I walked by the lake near our house. The water was still, the kind of stillness that holds its breath before a storm. I looked down and saw something glinting on the sand, a piece of red ribbon, damp and frayed. I bent to pick it up. It was tied in a loop, like it had once held a small object. For a moment, I imagined the rusted key resting at its center. The ribbon smelled faintly of salt and smoke. By then, I'd stopped pretending it was coincidence. Someone was watching me, testing how far they could push before I'd react. The flowers, the email, the photograph, each one a whisper leading back to the same grave. I told myself I wouldn't give in to fear. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty silk-lined coffin waiting, patient, as if it already knew I'd be coming. The 30th memorial for Ethan Ward was held at the town hall that overlooked the lake. Someone from the Veterans Association had organized it. A polished, polite gesture to honor the lost engineer of the Aurora. I hadn't wanted a public ceremony, but they insisted. 30 years deserves remembrance, they said. I told myself I could manage one speech. One more performance of the loyal widow. The hall was packed. Old colleagues, neighbors, students from the local maritime school. The air smelled faintly of varnish and rain-soaked coats. On stage, a projector displayed Ethan's photograph, the one from our wedding, his smile too perfect to be real. The moderator handed me the microphone. Please welcome Dr. Helena Ward, wife of the late Ethan Ward. Applause rose, soft but persistent. I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the wooden floor like a metronome marking time I no longer believed in. I began the way widows are supposed to. 30 years ago today, a man I loved boarded a vessel that never came home. People say time heals, but in my experience time only teaches you how to pretend. I paused, scanning the crowd. Familiar faces blurred into one sea of politeness. The air conditioning hummed. My throat tightened, but I kept going. He believed the sea could be tamed with magnetism, that technology could save lives. Perhaps that faith was what killed him, but it was also what made him. Excuse me. A voice cut through the hall like a shard of glass. At first I thought it came from the back. A phone ringing, someone whispering. But then I saw her, a woman in the third row, standing tall, her hand trembling slightly as she pointed at the screen behind me. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, her accent southern, her tone shaking but resolute. But the man in that photograph. She paused, swallowing hard. I've seen him. In Panama. 3 years ago. A ripple spread through the audience. Soft murmurs, chairs creaking. Someone laughed nervously, assuming it was a mistake. Someone else whispered, "Is this a prank?" But the woman didn't flinch. He was alive. He called himself Edward. Edward Hall. I remember because he paid in cash, and his watch had those same initials. E. W. For a moment, the world narrowed to sound. The hum of the lights, the hiss of the mic pressed against my palm. I couldn't breathe. That's impossible, I managed, my voice thin. My husband died in 1995. I'm not mistaken, she said quietly. He stayed at my sister's guest house for 2 months. White. Said he was an engineer. Same face, just older. I swear it's him. Someone in the crowd gasped. The moderator tried to intervene. Ma'am, perhaps we can discuss this. But it was too late. The hall had already turned into a hive of whispers. I heard the mic slip from my fingers before I realized I'd dropped it. The thud echoed, sharp and metallic. Every head turned toward me, not out of pity but curiosity. I stood there, frozen, while the projector flickered behind me, Ethan's smiling face looming 10 feet tall. In that instant, I hated that smile. The same one I'd kissed goodnight 1,000 times. Mrs. Ward, the moderator murmured, trying to usher me off stage. But I couldn't move. My hands felt numb, my knees hollow. The woman stepped forward, holding out a folded photograph. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said softly. But if he's alive, You deserve to know. I looked at the photo. A candid shot of a man standing near a harbor, sunlight slicing across his jaw. He was older, hair grayer, but the line of his shoulders, the slight bend of his wrist, unmistakable. Ethan. The room tilted, the smell of lilies from the floral display mixed with the acrid tang of panic. Someone helped me into a chair, voices buzzing like insects around my head. Call an ambulance. She's in shock. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. But the only sound I truly heard was the steady, merciless click of the projector changing slides. Ethan laughing in one frame, Ethan at sea in another, Ethan, 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 until the light itself felt cruel. Later, outside, the woman approached me again. Rain had started to fall, thin and cold. She held out a business card. "Yeah, my name's Marion Lake. My sister runs the guest house. If you want to see the photo files, call me." I took the card without looking at it. "Did he say anything about me?" I asked. Marion hesitated. Only that he'd lost everything once, and that he couldn't go home again. When I got back to my car, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching the rain beat against the windshield like tiny fractures. 30 years. 30 years of graveside prayers, white lilies, lonely birthdays, and somewhere he'd been alive. Breathing, eating, laughing. I pressed my forehead against the wheel. My chest ached so badly, I thought I might actually die then and there. Because betrayal isn't the knife you see coming. It's the one that's been inside you all along, disguised as devotion. The next day, I went back to the cemetery. The red roses had returned, fresh again. This time I didn't touch them. I just stood there, drenched from the rain, staring at the flowers until their color began to bleed down the marble like veins. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll. Slow, deliberate, mournful. And for the first time in 30 years, I realized they weren't ringing for Ethan. They were ringing for me. That night, the rain hadn't stopped. It followed me home like a ghost that refused to be left outside. The house felt smaller than I remembered, ceilings lower, walls closer. Every picture frame seemed to watch me. I went straight to the study, turned on the single fluorescent lamp above my old forensic cabinet. The light was harsh, the kind that flattened color until everything looked sterile. Maybe that's why I liked it. Under that light, nothing could hide. On the table lay the object I hadn't dared to examine until now. The rusted key found in Ethan's coffin. I placed it carefully on a glass slide, the way I used to handle evidence from crime scenes. Old habits die hard. The metal was corroded but intact, its head shaped like a ship's wheel. Along the shaft, faint letters were still visible. 1T5H vault section. Vault. The word snagged my breath. In naval engineering, vault section referred to the cargo bay, the area sealed off for classified materials. But it could also mean something else. A storage, a hiding place, a chamber where the truth waited for permission to breathe. "If you really died, Ethan," I whispered into the empty room, "why did you leave me a key?" No answer, of course. Only the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the faint tapping of rain against glass. I picked up the key again. It felt colder than metal should. The teeth were sharp, uneven, as if filed by hand. This wasn't a house key. It was industrial. A lock meant to keep more than doors shut. I pulled open the drawers of my archive cabinet. Decades of old case files, photos, evidence bags. The smell of paper dust and formalin rose up like memory. Inside, I found the folder labeled Aurora Explosion, 1995. I hadn't looked at it in years. The file was thin, too thin for an accident that killed 12 men. Most of the documents were Navy reports, heavy on technical jargon, light on specifics. The pages mentioned classified propulsion testing and combustion failure. But the photo attached to Ethan's personnel record stopped me. The image was cropped at the shoulder, the background blacked out with ink. Standard protocol for government confidentiality, yet the file number in the corner. W12 Vault matched the engraving on the key. My pulse began to quicken, a dull echo in my ears. Someone had wanted me to find this. Someone had made sure that key came back to me. I went to my computer, opened the folder where I'd saved Marion Lake's photograph from the memorial, the one of the man she'd seen in Panama. I zoomed in on his wrist. The grainy pixels sharpened just enough to reveal a glint of silver. The same watch. His watch. The one I buried. I felt my throat tighten. The logical part of my brain, the part trained to identify evidence, to separate fact from hysteria, began cataloging possibilities: coincidence, mistaken identity, fraud, or survival. But even as I listed them, I knew only one explanation fit. Ethan hadn't died. He'd erased himself. I spent the next hour pacing, every step between reason and rage. Gus was too quiet. The ticking of the wall clock sounded obscene. All these years, I had built my life around a lie. Accepted condolences, paid bills, raised our son, visited a grave that held nothing but a key to his other life. How long had he planned this? From the beginning? Or had there been a moment, one heartbeat, when he decided I was easier to bury than to face? "You were meticulous," I muttered, staring at the key. "Even your disappearance had engineering precision." I thought of the red roses, the anonymous emails, the handwriting on that photograph. He's closer than you think. Whoever had sent them wasn't taunting me. They were preparing me. I sat down at the desk and opened the drawer where I kept my financial documents. Inside was the insurance folder, neatly organized, labeled Ward Ethan. Deceased benefits. 30 years of monthly deposits. 30 years of accepting money tied to a death that never happened. My fingers hovered over the phone as I dialed the insurance company's after-hours hotline. The operator sounded cheerful, detached. "How can we assist you this evening, Mrs. Ward?" "I need to terminate a policy," I said. My voice came out calm, almost clinical. "May I ask the reason for cancellation?" "Because the dead man isn't dead." A pause. Then typing sounds. "Ma'am, that's a serious claim?" "So was my marriage," I said and hung up. The silence afterward was electric. I felt lighter. Not free exactly, but unchained. I opened a new document on my computer. The cursor blinked. Patient. Subject: investigation. Ward: Ethan A. K.A. Edward Hall. Objective: determine the origin and function of key W12. Method: follow evidence, not emotion. I typed those lines out of instinct, but my hands were shaking. For the first time in decades, I wasn't dissecting someone else's mystery. I was dissecting my own. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake. I turned off the light and watched the storm through the window. The reflection in the glass startled me. My own face, pale and angular, eyes harder than I remembered. The woman looking back wasn't the widow anymore. She was the forensic pathologist who'd forgotten how to stop searching. I whispered to her reflection, "If he's alive, I'll find him. And when I do, I'll make him tell me why he needed to bury me alive too." The storm answered with lightning, splitting the dark like a photograph burning from the edges inward. That night, I gathered everything tied to Ethan, his letters, the watch receipts, the memorial brochures, and fed them into the fireplace. The flames hissed, devouring 30 years of grief in minutes. When it was over, I placed the key on the mantelpiece. Its metal glowed faintly orange from the firelight, like a warning or an invitation. I didn't know yet what it opened. But for the first time, I wanted to find out, not as a widow, but as a witness. Lucas didn't call for days. Not after the memorial. Not after the scene that left my name echoing in that hall like an aftertaste of shame. I assumed he was giving me space. Or worse, avoiding me because he didn't know which version of his father to believe in anymore. The house became unbearably quiet. No footsteps, no voices, just the refrigerator humming like a tired witness. The only sound I couldn't silence was the clock, steady, merciless, ticking through my sleepless nights. On the 4th evening, I found a folded note on the kitchen table. It wasn't in an envelope, just lying there, as if he wanted me to find it immediately. The handwriting was his. Neat, deliberate, too mature for his age. Mom, don't dig up the past. Hua. Dad had his reasons. No greeting, no signature. I read the line again and again, until the words started to blur. Dad had his reasons. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of betrayal spoken in someone else's defense. My own son's handwriting looked like a verdict. I sat down, the note trembling between my fingers. The lamp on the counter flickered once, twice, before holding steady. My reflection on the window looked like a stranger. The kind of woman who could spend 30 years mourning a lie and still need proof to stop. I tried calling him, but every call went to voicemail. Lucas, it's me, I said, leaving messages that grew shorter each time. We need to talk. Please. Nothing. I drove to his apartment the next day. His car was gone, mailbox empty. The neighbor said he'd taken some time off. Off from what? From me? From the truth? That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the kind Ethan used to drink when pretending to celebrate. It burned down my throat, bitter and necessary. He had his reasons, I whispered aloud, echoing Lucas's note. Then tell me, what reason is worth erasing your own name? The following morning, I noticed small things missing from the house. The photo of Lucas with his father from when he was 5. Gone. A few folders from my archive cabinet, the ones labeled Aurora Incident. The lock on the drawer wasn't broken, just picked cleanly, precisely. Less, someone had taken them. Someone who knew exactly where to look. For a brief, disorienting second, I thought of Ethan's hands again, steady, careful, never stained. The way he used to fix nothing but always seemed to know how things worked. Maybe Lucas hadn't left the note alone. Maybe he'd been here. Maybe he'd come for more than closure. That evening, I stood outside on the porch, the lake stretching black and silent in front of me. The air smelled of copper and wet pine. Somewhere far off, a thundercloud was forming, the first flash of lightning pulsing behind the hills. Storms on the lake were deceptive. Calm at first, mirror-flat water, air too still to trust. I'd learned to recognize that stillness. It wasn't peace. It was warning. The kind that comes right before everything tears open. Inside, I unfolded the note again. I studied every stroke of ink like evidence. The way the M in Mom curved slightly backward, the faint smudge near past where his hand must have hesitated. He'd written it quickly, under pressure. Dad had his reasons. That word again. Had. Past tense. Did Lucas mean he knew? That he'd met him? That he'd helped him stay hidden? A cold thought crawled up my spine. Had they been in contact this whole time? Around midnight, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered before thinking. Silence. Then a voice. Young, unsteady. Mom. Lucas, please, just stop. It'll make this worse. Worse than what? I asked. Than burying a man who never died? You don't understand. Then help me understand. There was a pause. A breath on the other end, the kind that carries both guilt and fear. He's not who you think he is. Then who is he? But the line went dead. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen until it dimmed. Outside, the wind began to rise, the trees bending in surrender. I could hear the first raindrops hitting the roof, one after another, like the slow ticking of a clock that no longer told time but counted down instead. I folded Lucas's note and placed it beside the key on the mantelpiece. Both gleamed faintly under the lightning flash, metal and ink, proof of two different betrayals. I realized then that the silence wasn't emptiness at all. It was anticipation. Something was coming, and I was finally done pretending I didn't want to face it. Lucas's house was smaller than I remembered, tucked at the edge of town near the shipyard. The same one where Ethan used to work. The air smelled of salt and diesel, that sour mix of memory and machinery. I hadn't called first. I didn't want to give him time to prepare. When he opened the door, his expression flickered. Surprise, then guilt, then a kind of resigned calm. The kind of face people wear when they've rehearsed an argument in their heads and know they're going to lose. Mom, he said quietly, you shouldn't be here. Neither should your father, I replied. And yet, here we are. Inside, the place was meticulously neat, the same sterile order Ethan always demanded. Not a cup out of place, not a wrinkle on the couch throw. But what caught my eye was the photograph on the table near the window. It showed Lucas and a man standing at a dock, the sun sharp, the water blazing behind them. The man wore sunglasses, a navy jacket. He was older, heavier around the shoulders, but the posture, I knew that posture. Ethan. I picked up the photo, my hand trembling. When was this taken? Lucas closed his eyes. Last summer. The world tilted. I steadied myself on the table, the edges of the frame biting into my fingers. So he's alive? Yes. You've seen him? Yes. For how long? His voice was steady but small. Since I was 14. There it was. The sentence that split time in half. I looked at my son. My own flesh, my only living witness, and realized he'd been living in two worlds. Mine, made of ghosts, and his, made of lies. 14? I repeated, my voice cracking. You've known for half your life that he's alive? Lucas nodded once, eyes down. He found me first. He said it had to stay between us. Can you and him? I laughed, the sound harsh. You mean between the man who faked his death and the boy he used as an alibi? Wasn't like that. And what was it, Lucas? A game? A research project in deceit? He flinched. He said you wouldn't understand. He's right about that, I said, my throat tightening. Because I don't understand how a man can let his wife bury an empty coffin, or how a son can look his mother in the eye for 20 years and say nothing. Lucas ran a hand through his hair. Mom, please. He had no choice. Everyone has a choice. Dying isn't one of them. Faking it is. He was part of something bigger. He said if he came back, people would get hurt. And I didn't count as people? My voice rose before I could stop it. The walls seemed to echo the words back at me. Didn't count. Didn't count. He tried to speak, but I cut him off. You've been taking his money, haven't you? Lucas's silence was answer enough. Through someone else, I pressed. He's been sending it scholarships, transfers, whatever name he's hiding behind. It was for school. He wanted to help. He wanted to own you, I snapped. The way he owned me. Lucas's face hardened. He saved us, Mom. You forget how bad it was after the explosion. We were falling apart. We had nothing. His money kept us alive. And his lie kept us dead, I said softly. That silenced him. We stood there for a long time, neither of us moving. The photograph trembled in my hand, the frame slick with sweat. I placed it back on the table as carefully as if it were evidence at a crime scene. Where is he? I can't tell you. You will tell me. Mom, please, he said. Don't say what he said. Say what you believe. Lucas's jaw clenched. His eyes glistened, but he refused to look away. I believe he did what he had to do. To who? I asked quietly. To the people who hurt him, or the ones who loved him. He said nothing. I walked to the window. The harbor was visible from there. Cranes, ships, the gray sprawl of the docks. Somewhere beyond that water, Ethan had built a new life. One that didn't include funerals, or guilt, or me. The storm clouds from the previous night still hung low, heavy and metallic. I thought of all the times I'd told myself grief was sacred. That mourning him was the last connection we had. Now it felt obscene. You should have told me, I said finally. I wanted to, Lucas whispered. But he made me promise. He said you wouldn't survive the truth. The truth doesn't kill people, I said. Lies do. He turned toward me, anger sparking through his calm. You don't know what he's been through. Then tell me. I can't. Because you don't know? Or because you're protecting him? Lucas's voice dropped. Both. I stared at him, my son, my only child, and saw not the boy I raised, but the man his father had built in secret. You look like him when you lie, I said. It made him flinch. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Seconds stretched. I took a breath, forcing my voice to steady. Do you love him, Lucas? He nodded barely. Then you need to choose, I said. Because I can't live with both of you haunting me. You're asking me to betray my father. No, I said, my throat aching. I'm asking you not to betray your mother. He walked away from me, pacing toward the kitchen, gripping the counter as if the solid surface could anchor him. He said he did it to protect us. There were things he discovered. Dangerous things. He couldn't stay. Protect us from what? Life? Love? Accountability? From people who would have killed him. And if they didn't, I would have, I muttered. He turned sharply. Don't say that. Why not? He killed me first. Not my body, but everything inside it. There was a long silence. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. The same mechanical heartbeat that had filled my own home for decades. I reached for the photograph again, tracing the outline of Ethan's shoulder with my finger. He looks happy, I said, almost proud. He misses you, Lucas whispered. I laughed, but it came out broken. Then maybe he should have stayed dead. Lucas's eyes brimmed with tears. You don't mean that. I mean every word. He shook his head, stepping closer. Mom, you taught me to look for evidence. To believe what's in front of me. Well, he's alive. Isn't that proof enough that he still loves us? No, I said. It's proof that he's a coward. The storm outside finally broke. Rain slamming against the windows, wind howling through the cracks. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I turned toward the door, picking up my coat. If he contacts you again, tell him I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for answers. Lucas's voice followed me, trembling. What are you going to do? I looked back at him, my hand on the doorknob. What I should have done 30 years ago. Which is, stop letting men decide which lies I can live with. As I stepped outside, thunder rolled over the harbor. Deep, resonant, final. The rain hit my face, cold and sharp, but I welcomed it. It felt like evidence, too. Undeniable, immediate, cleansing. I didn't look back. Because if I did, I knew I'd see my son standing in that doorway, torn between two versions of the same man, and I couldn't bear to see which one he'd choose. It started as a whisper, a headline no one should have dared to print. Dr. Helena Ward accused of faking husband's death to collect insurance payout. By noon, it was everywhere, the local paper. Then, the online tabloids. Then national morning news. My photo beside Ethan's, or Edward Hall's as he now called himself, under a split headline, Wife or Widow? The 30-year lie. I watched the segment on a muted television at the hospital cafeteria. The news anchor smiled with that neutral pity reserved for public scandals. Behind her, they flashed a picture from the memorial. Me, mid-speech, eyes wide, mouth half open. They made it look like confession. Within hours, the calls began. Colleagues asking for clarification. Students from my old university sending cautious messages. We hope it isn't true. Then came the email from the Board of Forensic Science, subject line in bold. Notice of suspension. Pending investigation. Just like that. 30 years of work erased with a single accusation. The letter was polite, bureaucratic, venomous in its civility. Given recent allegations concerning your professional and personal conduct, the board deems it necessary to temporarily relieve you of your duties until further notice. They didn't even use my title. I laughed when I read it, a short, bitter sound that startled even me. Of course, it was coming. This was exactly how Ethan operated. Quietly, efficiently, with just enough distance to keep his hands clean. The next blow came 2 days later. A courier delivered a thick envelope to my doorstep, embossed seal, no return address. Inside, a formal cease and desist letter from the law firm Henderson and Clay, representing one Mr. Phone, Edward Hall. The message was short, surgical. Our client requests that you refrain from any public or private statements implying a connection between Dr. Ward and Mr. Hall. Such claims, if continued, may result in legal action and could further damage the reputation of your son, Mr. Call. Lucas Ward, currently employed at Hall Maritime Innovations. There it was, his leverage. My son. Ethan didn't threaten me. He threatened the one thing he knew I couldn't sacrifice. He was clever, always had been, but so was I. I called Marion Lake, the woman who had spoken at the memorial. She sounded nervous, her voice low. They came to my sister's guest house, she said. 2 men in suits. Said they were from the State Department asking questions about you. About me. Did you tell them anything? Only that I stand by what I saw. But they warned me not to get involved. And you? I don't scare easy, doctor. But whatever your husband's into, it's bigger than a fake death. That night, I searched Edward Hall online. His name filled the screen. A successful marine technology consultant, recently awarded a contract for government defense research. There were photos from conferences, ribbon cuttings, board meetings. Always surrounded by admirers, always at the center but never quite in focus. In one image, taken only 6 months earlier, he was shaking hands with a senator. His left wrist glinted. The same silver watch engraved E.W. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was thriving. And he'd used my silence, my grief, as the foundation for his new empire. I printed everything. Articles, photos, corporate filings. Spread them across the dining table like evidence from a crime scene. I labeled each with sticky notes. Motive, timeline, witness, cover story. Every instinct I'd trained as a forensic expert came roaring back. Except this time, the cadaver was a marriage. By the end of the week, the story had turned uglier. A podcaster claimed to have exclusive documents proving Helena Ward collected over $400,000 in fraudulent death benefits. A talk show host mocked my dramatic outburst at the memorial. Even the cemetery where Ethan's grave had been exhumed received hate mail. How much did she pay you to fake the records? I became the villain in a story I hadn't written. And I knew exactly who the author was. On the 5th night, someone spray-painted LIAR across my front gate. It didn't call the police. I stood there under the porch light, staring at the dripping letters, red against white wood, and thought, at least now the world sees what he made me into. A week later, a man showed up at my door. Gray suit, slick hair, smile like a blade. Dr. Ward, he greeted, flashing credentials. I represent Mr. Hall. Then you represent a corpse, I said, leaving the door half open. He ignored the jab. My client wishes to resolve this amicably. He believes continued exposure will only harm your son's career. So that's the plan, I said. You bury me again, this time alive. We're simply asking for your discretion. Tell him I've been discreet for 30 years. His smile didn't move. You've had a good life. Dr. dropped her. Ward, let the past rest. It's not the past I'm after, I said. It's the truth. The lawyer's eyes flickered, then hardened. Truth is expensive. Then he should start saving, I said, and closed the door in his face. That night, I took out the key again. W12 Forns 8's vault section. The metal caught the light from the fireplace. It had become more than evidence now, it was a promise. If Ethan had buried his secrets, then somewhere there was a vault, literal or metaphorical, waiting to be unlocked. I began retracing his paper trail. Edward Hall had registered a company address in Panama 15 years ago, the same place Marion had seen him. From there, the network branched across shell corporations and consulting firms, all linked to a naval research account code identical to the Aurora project. He hadn't fled to save us. He'd fled to profit from the very experiment that supposedly killed him. The next morning, I received another call, this time from Lucas. His voice was tight. Mom, stop digging. You're making things worse. For who? For me, for Dad, for everyone. You mean Edward? He's trying to protect us. He's trying to erase me, Lucas. There was silence on the line, then a soft, desperate whisper. Please, just let it go. If you wanted a mother who lets things go, I said, you should have buried me next to him. I hung up before he could reply. By evening, my phone buzzed again. An unknown number. A distorted voice said, You don't know what you're opening, Dr. Karya. Ward, leave the vault alone. Then a click. Dead air. I sat in the dark, phone still in my hand, pulse hammering. The vault. The same word etched on the key, the same code in Ethan's files. He was watching. Or someone was. For the first time in years, I felt fear. Not the sterile kind you feel in a lab, but the human kind, the one that reminds you you're still alive. I poured coffee, sat at the table surrounded by papers, and whispered into the silence. You built your life on a lie, Ethan. You made me your alibi. But you forgot. I know how to exhume the dead. The next morning, I drafted a statement. Not for the press, not for the board, but for the record. My record. If I disappear, know that it wasn't grief that killed me. It was the truth trying to surface. I signed it, sealed it, and slipped it into my safety deposit box. Then I opened my laptop, created a new file. Subject: Operation Vault. Objective: retrieve physical evidence of Project Aurora's cover-up. Hello, alias Ethan Ward. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about reclaiming my reputation or even punishing him. It was about proof, the one thing every investigator chases until it kills them. He had buried more than his past. He'd buried 12 men's truth along with it. And if he thought I'd go quietly into the ground again, he'd forgotten who taught him how to hide a body. I met Marion Lake at a diner just off the interstate, the kind of place where the coffee is bad, but the waitress minds her own business. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly in the fog, flickering between OPEN and OEN, as if even the word itself was tired of honesty. Marion slid into the booth opposite me, trench coat still damp from the rain. She looked older than she had at the memorial, harder around the eyes, the way people look when they've seen something they shouldn't have. You said you had something, I began. She nodded, dropping a thick envelope on the table. You're right, Helena. Your husband didn't just fake his death. He franchised it. I opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of contracts, shipping manifests, and one government seal I recognized too well. Department of Biomedical Research Oversight. He's working with them? I asked. Not exactly, she said. He's contracting through them. Hall Maritime Innovations just won a multi-million-dollar deal to transport medical specimens for a research nonprofit. She paused, letting that sink in. Let's switch nonprofit. I scanned the paperwork, and my stomach dropped. Genexa Biotech Institute. 20 years ago, I'd helped expose that same organization for trafficking unclaimed corpses under the guise of scientific donation. They'd been shut down, or so I thought. They're back, I whispered. Marion stirred her coffee. New name, same directors. And your husband's company is their transport contractor. In another page, there, printed at the bottom of a staff list, was a familiar signature. Ethan Ward, disguised under the title Security Supervisor. The handwriting hadn't changed, meticulous, curved, the same loops he used to sign birthday cards. I felt the air leave my lungs. He didn't just survive, I said. He went into business with the people we once condemned. He's covering their logistics, shipments in and out of Panama, Mexico, and Louisiana. Medical containers, official stamps, fake IDs. And the bodies? Real, Marion said quietly. Just not legally obtained. The waitress passed by, refilling our cups. Neither of us touched them. I stared at Ethan's signature again. The neat flourish on the E. The decisive cut of the W. He'd always taken pride in his handwriting, as if even his lies needed to look elegant. He used my research, I murmured. Back when we were married, he had access to my case files. Pathology transport protocols, refrigeration thresholds, labeling systems. He memorized all of it. Helena, Marion said gently, he built a smuggling empire off your science. The words landed like a scalpel. I flipped through more pages, correspondence between Hall Maritime and a subsidiary called Vault Logistics LLC. The word vault repeated over and over, stamped across invoices and transport codes. Vault 12, Vault 23, Vault 48. The same pattern, the same word engraved on the key sitting at home on my mantel. This is it, I whispered. The vault isn't a metaphor. It's an actual storage site, coded by region. Owain leaned forward. I traced one of the shipments. Vault 12 corresponds to an abandoned naval depot outside Chicago. Decommissioned 15 years ago, now leased under a private research shell. And Ethan's name? Signed as access supervisor. A chill slid down my spine. I took a pen from my bag, circled the signature, and wrote beneath it, loving. Proof of involvement. If I can get inside that depot, I said slowly, I can expose everything. The fake research, the trafficking, the false identity. Helena, this isn't a movie. These people make people disappear. He already made me disappear once. Marian sighed, rubbing her temples. You'll need more than courage. You'll need access. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the key. It caught the dim diner light, gleaming faintly between us. I have it. Marian froze. That's W25, vault section. For a moment, the only sound was the buzz of the neon sign outside, the word open flashing red across Marian's face. She stared at me like she was seeing the ghost of someone she'd buried long ago. Helena, if that key fits what I think it does, it's not just a clue. It's an invitation. Then it's time I RSVP'd. We drove to her office after midnight, a narrow suite above a pawn shop. She booted up her computer, pulling up restricted maritime databases through connections she shouldn't have had. Here, she said, pointing to a satellite map. This is the Chicago depot. Security clearance under Hall Maritime. Look, only 2 active badges recorded in the past year. One is Ethan's. The other, she zoomed in on the entry log. Ward Lucas. I froze. No, I whispered. I'm sorry, Helena. He's listed as site operations assistant. Your son's been there. I sank into the chair, my heart pounding. The room tilted, pixels blurring into static. Lucas hadn't just known, it's worked for him. He dragged our son into this, I said. One, to his second life. Maybe Lucas doesn't know what he's part of. He's his father's son, I muttered. And his mother's mistake. Marian closed the file, locking eyes with me. You can still walk away. Send this to the authorities anonymously. And let them bury it again? No. I stood, gathering the papers. If I've learned anything from autopsies, it's that decay tells a story. You just have to cut deep enough to read it. I slipped the documents into my bag. My fingers brushed the key again, cold and certain. I'm going to that depot. I need backup. I have you, I said. Marian exhaled, resigned. You always did know how to ruin a quiet life. He ruined it first. As we left the diner, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick with reflected light. The air smelled of ozone and gasoline. The scent of something new beginning or something old being unearthed. I turned the key in my palm, feeling its teeth bite into my skin. For 30 years, I believed it symbolized love, or memory, or closure. Now I knew it was none of those things. It was a map to a place where the truth had been locked away with the dead. And I was done waiting for permission to open it. I'm not an emotional person. I've spent my life dissecting the truth layer by layer, taking meticulous notes, keeping track of evidence. Now, when faced with a lie that's ingrained in my blood, I'm doing what I do best. Gathering data, minimizing risk, preparing an exit plan. Marian nods when I tell her the idea. Take over the medical ethics conference where Edward Hall will be speaking and turn the stage into a platform for exposure. That way, he can't call a lawyer to silence the entire room, she says. I like the way she thinks. Simple. Public. Giving no room for manipulation. The plan has 6 clear parts. Every item must have a responsible person, a time, and backup evidence. Primary evidence. Documents Marian found. Contracts, bills of lading, employee lists, Ethan Ward's signature as security supervisor. The original must be in public view. Photocopies are not enough. The plan, go to Vault 112, a depot outside Chicago, to get a copy of the shipping book, the inventory list, the hard drive containing the shipping database, and If I'm lucky, the purchase receipt that shows the specimen's origin. I carry the key I found, which I put on a pendant around my neck, a sign that I'm here by accident. The key is now the vehicle and the statement. Field support, recon and entry. Marion is in charge of tracking the depot's personnel schedule, printing out shift schedules and camera maps. She has old resources so she can download the patrol route map, the guard post. I'll wear work clothes, a hard hat with a fake warehouse worker badge. Things I can borrow from people in the logistics industry. No drama, no cool action, just a regular worker. Timing. Mid-shift change, when the crowd is high but attention is low. Marion would be the security officer, making the phone call asking for information, causing the guard to open the door. Gather technical evidence. I brought a portable hard drive, a small mirrorless camera, an infrared flashlight to check for traces invisible during the day, and electrostatic gloves. Everything was packed like a forensic toolkit. I would take pictures of the shipping labels, Vault 112 codes, seals, and cold labels. If I found a container labeled biological specimens without proper paperwork, that was the most compelling evidence. HS, legal and witness safety. Before doing so, Marion contacted a former federal attorney of hers, someone who could get the documents if we were arrested. The attorney agreed to keep a safe copy and release it to the media if we disappeared. I prepared a public statement, pre-printed, and sealed the files. If I disappear, publish these files. Copies were placed in 2 places, Marion's safe and an email account scheduled to be sent automatically in 48 hours. Conference scenario, public reveal. Conference day, I registered as a guest and asked to speak during the Q&A. Marion would send the organizers an email. Hint. About the ethics of transporting biomedical samples beforehand, prompting them to give me priority. I didn't plan to show all the evidence on stage at once that would be easily blocked by his lawyers. Instead, show a single slide, a photocopy with Vault Logistics stamp and Ethan's signature, and then hand over a USB key to the press present. The action had to be short, sharp, and leave him no time to react in public. Exit plan, and plan B. If things got discovered at the depot, we would leave immediately. Marion would make a lot of noise, make a fake emergency call to draw the security guards away. I wasn't looking for violence. The goal was to collect evidence, not escalate to violence. If I was arrested, the lawyer had an emergency motion to appeal, and an automated email would forward the file to the major newspapers. As Marion and I broke down the mission, we wrote down each time point, each location, each person. The plan was printed out, signed like a contract. Helena Ward. Lead investigator, Marion Lake. Field ops, attorney, R. Klein. Legal hold. The signing made it all more real, cemented by responsibility. The rehearsal took place at my house that evening. I was a worker, Marion was a security guard. We rehearsed the entrance, the exit, the fake radio, how to hide the camera in the jacket. I remembered the feeling of standing on the operating table. Every move had to be precise, leaving no trace. Before leaving, I looked at the key around my neck. The cold metal pressed against my skin, heavy with determination. Chattered to myself, this time, I'll use my forensic skills to exhume the living. Marion patted me on the shoulder, a wordless pat. She understood what I needed. Not disgust, not revenge, but justice as I best understood it, with evidence. The night before my departure, I made a little will. The original documents and a recording of my testimony to send to the newspaper if I went missing. I locked the door, turned on the outside lights, and couldn't sleep. My mind was spinning around one question. When the vault door was opened, would the portrait of the person behind it resemble the memory I had buried? I no longer wanted to bury the female memoria. I wanted to dig, and this time I had a map and a key. The conference hall smelled like cheap coffee and fear. Fluorescent lights made everyone look slightly unreal. Teeth too white, eyes too bright. The banner behind the podium read, Ethics in Biomedical Transport. Oh, transparency and trust. A cruel title for the man who had built his life on secrecy. Edward Hall. Ethan, by every private memory I had, stood at the lectern with the aplomb of a man who had never answered for anything. He spoke about consent and chain of custody, about the moral obligations of researchers transporting biological specimens. He used the word integrity slowly, like a talisman. I watched him for a long time from the back row. From where I sat, his profile was familiar in the way a scar is familiar, the shape you can trace in the dark. He talked about procedures and audits and the public trust. The audience nodded. Someone took a picture with a tablet. Cameras lined the walls, paid to document his righteousness. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but rehearsal is for plays. For what I was about to do, practice mattered only insofar as it kept my hands steady. Marian had already done the first part of our work. She'd leaked a copy of the vault manifests and the shipping invoices to a small network of independent reporters who were at the conference. She'd also made sure an investigative journalist from a national outlet was in the front row. That journalist had pocketed a USB key with a secure link to the digital evidence. If anything happened to me that night, the files would go live in under an hour. We'd given ourselves leverage and an exit strategy. I rose during the Q&A. The room had that peculiar polite hush of an auditorium when a speaker expects to be flattered. I walked forward with a slow, deliberate step. The murmurs rippled through the seats. Who is she? Another protester? But I had the moderator on my side. She recognized my name. She'd invited me when Marian suggested I be given a question. The arrangement was small, but crucial. Dr. Ward, you have the floor, she said into the microphone, and the hum of cameras intensified. I stepped into the light. For a second, I felt the raw, ridiculous tremor of standing under a bright lamp and knowing the whole world could see my face crack. Then I remembered the key at my throat, cool against my skin like a coin of accusation, and the tremor steadied. Edward? I began, and his face tightened at the sound of the name he no longer used. You asked everyone here to trust the ethics of your work. You asked them to believe in transparency. I'm here to show that transparency can be bought and that your ethics were for sale. A ripple of confusion passed over the audience. Camera flashes snapped like distant gunfire. He smiled, a practiced mask. You've been very generous with rhetoric tonight. Doctor, he began. Don't call me doctor. Ward, in order to flinch me from speaking, I said. Call me Helena. Call me the woman who dug up a grave last month and found a key. A very specific key. W12, vault section. Quiet. A single cough. The journalist in the front fumbled with his phone, ready. I clicked the small remote in my palm. The projector hummed, flickered, and then threw my face onto the big screen for everyone to see. Behind me, a slide appeared. Plain. Forensic. Impossible to shrug off. Header. Evidence. Chain of custody. Then Marian's logo. Then the warehouse manifest copies with stamped codes. Then a line that read, Vault 12. Registered to? Hall, Maritime. Access Supervisor. E. Ward. A murmur. He looked at the screen as if he could read a different story there. You talk about chain of custody, I said. Here is one. These manifests show shipments labeled biological specimens traveling from ports in Panama and New Orleans to Vault 12 in Chicago. The invoices list procurement sources as unattributed donor accounts, a euphemism your company used to mask the origin of human remains. He opened his mouth. Those documents can be forged. They would have been, I said, if Marian hadn't traced the signatures. If I hadn't found your name printed under security supervisor in the staff log. If I hadn't opened the safe at Vault 12 and taken copies of the invoices myself. The audience reacted like someone who has been slapped in the face by a fact. Gasps, whispers, the distant metallic clack of a camera adjusting its lens. I advanced the PowerPoint. The next slide was the one I had told no one would believe until they saw the words themselves. A DNA report. I had spent 2 days at a lab I trusted, old colleagues who owed me favors and answers. From the rusted watch I once buried, a watch I'd insisted be surrendered to me when they handed me the box 30 years ago, forensic extraction had yielded epithelial cells trapped in the crevices of the band. Those cells produced a DNA profile. Marion's contact in Panama had obtained a copy of Edward Hall's passport application, public enough to pull a cheek swab from a photograph, private enough that an investigator could source a comparative sample. The lab compared the markers. An unequivocal match. On the big screen, there was a printout with hospital-grade formatting. Ethan Ward, baseline profile. Y chromosome STR match. Edward Hall, operational alias. MATCH. 100% concordance across 23 loci. You could have heard the conference brochure hit the floor. For a man who built a life on plausible deniability, a DNA match is a collapse. He paled. Not in the theater pale, but in the animal way of someone who has been caught entering an empty den. You can't present DNA without chain of custody. His lawyer barked from the front row, though he sounded small. I turned, not to the lawyer but to the crowd. I'm a forensic pathologist, I said. I've worked supply chains and body transfers in hospitals and research institutions my whole adult life. I know how evidence is handled. I also know how people try to bury the truth. We documented the chain of custody, the transport manifests, Hall's contracts with Genexa, the invoices for specimens purchased, legally untraceable, ethically void. I clicked again. The screen filled with photocopies of invoices, stamps, receipts from a supplier in Veracruz, a letter from a shell broker instructing shipment descriptions be coded as non-regulated tissues. There were names, account numbers, signatures. Ethan's flourish, unmistakable. You taught me to read signatures, I said, not to the room but to him. You taught me the value of a clean line. You signed the documents you wanted to be read. He made a move toward the podium. People shifted in their seats, the scent of coffee and perfume thickening. His voice was low when he spoke. No lilt of charm could smooth it. Helena, he said, you're making allegations without context. These are commercial documents, taken out of context. This is libel. You will have your lawyers, I replied, and they will argue. I raised the small transparent evidence bag we placed on the lectern in front of the microphone earlier. A clear, sealed pouch containing a photocopy of a vault manifest and a small rusted key photograph. But the context is simple. Your company bought bodies that were not donated with consent. They were procured illicitly, labeled as research material. 12 men supposedly killed on the Aurora never had their remains properly accounted for. Those remains were bought and sold. The invoices we recovered show payments to accounts known to traffic unclaimed corpses. Your signature is on the access log to where they were stored. Your face is the one I saw in Panama. Your watch is the one I buried. He stared at the watch of his life, displayed like a souvenir of his own undoing. For a second, I wondered if the man in front of me felt remorse. It passed like a shadow, the moderator stammered, trying to regain control. Reporters had already started to ask questions. The murmurs had turned into a swell. Someone yelled, "How did you get the DNA?" The lab's notation was clear on the slide, but the scientist's name was blacked in the printed copy. I didn't hide the source. The lab had asked to remain confidential until they were subpoenaed, but they'd promised the data would hold. He tried to leave. That was his instinct, to remove himself from the room, from the evidence, from the sound of people watching. Security men moved to block the aisle. He stepped back, then pushed through a courtesy corridor on the side of the stage. Cameras pivoted, microphones thrust forward like talons. The threshold between the man and the crowd closed behind him, but the world had already widened around the story. I walked to the edge of the stage and lifted the small pouch Marion had photographed earlier. The key hung around my neck like blasphemy. I raised it so the lights caught the rusted teeth. "You remember this?" I said, loud enough that the reporters in the front row leaned in. "You told me once, before you left, that keys open rooms and rooms keep secrets." You were right. This key didn't open the grave you told me you wanted to rest in. It opened a vault evidence of everything you hid. In that vault. I paused and let the words sit in the auditorium like a verdict. Our invoices dated 1994 years before we were told any specimen shipments began. Those invoices show payments for whole body donations purchased under fraudulent guises. We have delivery logs, payment confirmations, and witness statements from handlers who identified Hall Maritime employees as the recipients. He stopped in the hallway, like a man who had been run through by words. He glanced at the door, the exit, the growing crowd. Reporters surged to follow. Someone shouted his name. He covered his face with his hand, as if to protect it from the flash of truth. My husband used to say, I continued, steadier now, that corpses don't lie. He was wrong. The living speak more loudly. They fabricate, they launder, they dress their crimes in wet lab coats and call it science. A camera caught his profile as he passed the curtain head down, shoulders hunched. He tried to straighten his tie. The national journalist who had the USB in his pocket was already dialing his editor. Someone handed a microphone in his path. He didn't take it. He was escorted out, not as a man accused being led for questioning, but as a man fleeing his own confession. Chaos erupted. Phones streamed footage. Tweets spun into headlines. Marine research? Mogul exposed? Key evidence in smuggling scandal. DNA match of disappeared engineer. The conference devolved into a press scrum. People clustered around me, asking for comments. I refused. I wanted the facts to speak. Facts don't beg for attention. They demand it. Later, the lawyer, Henderson and Clay, would issue a statement calling the allegations premature and defamatory. Their PR team would spin narratives about corporate compliance and administrative errors. But tonight, the images. My face in the projector, the manifest photocopies, the DNA match, were already circulating. A single photograph of Ethan stepping out of the side door would be posted online within minutes, and in those pixels his composure looked smaller. I didn't wait to see what the press would do with my life. I climbed down from the stage and walked out the same corridor he had taken. The night air was cold, and the neon from the conference center sign painted my hands blue. Reporters surrounded the doorway like flies. Someone shoved a microphone in my face, whispering, "Mrs. Ward, any comment?" I looked at the cameras, into lenses that had watched me mourn for 30 years. I thought about every white lily I'd placed on a grave that was empty. I thought about Lucy's note and my son's silence. I thought about Marion, sitting in a diner at midnight feeding me evidence like contraband. I lifted my chin. The words I had practiced for months, the ones that carried everything I meant, came out soft but clear. I don't need the law to convict him in the court of public scrutiny, I said. I need the world to know that the grave I tended was hollow, just like the promises he buried with it. The truth is not always delivered by courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives on a projector, in invoices, in signatures. Tonight, the world has that truth. He left before the applause could die down. He left with the dignity of a man who had always expected other people to bury his mistakes. The cameras followed him like judges. That night, as the conference center emptied and the projector cooled, I sat alone for a moment in the dark auditorium. My palms smelled faintly of dust and the metal of the key. For the first time in 30 years, the weight on my chest felt less like grief and more like something shifting, an old spine righting itself. Outside, the headlines were already forming. I knew the legal storm would come. I knew the threats, the lawsuits, the attempts to smear me as a disgruntled ex-wife would follow. I also knew something else. Evidence changes narratives. Evidence breaks the comfortable lies that allow decent people to sleep. Evidence forces institutions to answer. I thought of the empty coffin, of the rusted key, of the lilies and roses, of my son's handwriting. I thought of the man who had taught me how to read and then used what he taught to write his escape. On the screen of my mind's eye, Ethan's face flickered. Then, finally, it became a photograph I could hold up and say, plainly, this is who he chose to be. And in that small, terrible consolation, I found a beginning. The cemetery was empty when I returned. Autumn light spilled across the rows of stones like a soft confession. Honest, unembellished. The wind had that thin chill that smells of iron and leaves. For 30 years, this place had been a stage for my grief. Now, it felt more like a witness. The new stone had already been set. Ethan Ward, 1962-1995. Nothing more. No epitaph this time, no flourish about love or memory. Just a name, a range of years, and the silence that finally belonged to both of us. I knelt beside it, my knees sinking into the damp earth. The smell of soil filled my lungs, real, grounding. From my pocket, I drew out the key. The metal had dulled to the color of old blood. Its teeth were worn smooth, its edges no longer sharp enough to cut. For so long, I'd carried it like evidence. Now I wanted it to be nothing more than an object. I dug a small hollow in the dirt with my hands. The ground was cold, resisting at first, then softening under my fingers. When the hole was deep enough, I placed the key inside. "Oh, not for you," I whispered. "For the woman who believed you." The earth swallowed it easily, as if it had been waiting all this time. Behind me, footsteps crunched over gravel. I didn't turn until I heard his voice. Soft, tentative, older than it used to sound. "Mom." Lucas stood a few paces away, coat collar pulled up against the wind. His face looked like his father's, but gentler in the eyes. He hesitated before coming closer, like a boy returning to a classroom after doing something unforgivable. "I saw the news," he said. "They're saying Dad's company is under investigation. The government's frozen his assets. He's disappeared again." I nodded. "He's always been good at that." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know it would go this far. Didn't you?" The question hung there. Not accusation, not forgiveness. Just the truth, suspended between us like breath on a cold morning. He crouched beside me, hands clasped tight. The wind caught the edge of his sleeve, fluttering it like a flag of surrender. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said finally. "I didn't know who to believe. He told me you'd never understand, that you'd ruin everything if you found out." I studied his face. There were shadows under his eyes, sleepless nights, guilt, the exhaustion of carrying someone else's lies. "You were a child," I said. "He was the adult. He should have protected you, not used you." "But I helped him," he whispered. "I helped move the shipments. I thought it was research, something important." I reached out, placed a hand on his shoulder. His body shook under my palm. "Then stop helping him now," I said. "Help the truth instead." He looked at me, eyes wet. "What if the truth doesn't love us back?" "It rarely does," I said, "but it never abandons us either." For a while we stayed like that, mother and son beside a grave that held nothing but air and ashes of belief. The world around us moved quietly. A crow calling from the fence, a distant car door slamming, the dull rhythm of wind through dry grass. When he finally spoke again, his voice was hoarse. "They'll come after you, won't they?" "The company, the people he worked with." "Let them," I said. "I've already lived through worse, invisibility. And if they try to hurt you, then you'll know exactly what kind of men they are." He almost smiled. "Almost. You sound calm." "Because I am. Truth has no pulse to race." We stood, brushing dirt from our hands. I took one last look at the mound of soil where the key now rested. Leto flowers this time. No symbols. Just earth. Raw, unornamented, honest. Lucas slipped his hand into mine, hesitant at first, then firmer. The same warmth that once fit perfectly when he was a child still lingered there. "Mom," he said softly, "what happens now?" I thought for a long time before answering. "Now? We stop digging for the dead," I said, "and start living with the living." He nodded, his grip tightening. The kind of understanding that doesn't need ceremony. As we walked back toward the gate, the wind shifted. The trees rustled like pages being turned. I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The stone looked different now, smaller, almost ordinary. For the first time, that felt right. The key was buried. The grave was finally full. And I, at last, was empty of ghosts. A year later, the seasons had finished their slow circle. Michigan's lake had frozen and thawed again. The town, once hostile with whispers, had learned a new silence. The kind that comes after the storm has told all its secrets. I bought an old brick warehouse by the water, once used to store maritime equipment. The paint was peeling, the windows clouded with dust, but the bones of the place were sound. like an honest body waiting to breathe again. I named it Vault Studio. People smiled when they heard the name, assuming it was just poetic. But I liked the irony. A vault had been the place where truth was hidden. Now, it would be the place where women learned to unlock themselves. Vault Studio wasn't fancy. There were no mirrors, no polished floors, no advertisements promising empowerment in 10 lessons. Just long wooden tables, good light, and the quiet hum of conversation. We didn't teach art or science, not exactly. We taught memory. Each student brought something locked away. A letter, a photograph, a name they'd stopped saying aloud. I showed them how to look at these objects. The way I'd been trained to look at evidence, not with guilt or fear, but precision. Objects don't betray you, I'd tell them. They just keep the version of you that's ready to be found. We used brushes and solvents, microscopes and light boards. We cleaned the corners of old photographs, revealed faint handwriting on scorched paper, reconstructed diaries lost to mold and time. Every restoration was a small resurrection, not of the dead, but of the self. Some days, the smell of ethanol and dust brought me back to the morgue. But the air here was different. It wasn't sterile. It was alive with the sound of women reclaiming their stories. On the far wall hung the single framed photograph, the empty grave. I'd taken it the day I buried the key. The soil was uneven, still raw. Above it, in silver engraving, were the words, "Here lies the truth." She dared to dig. Beneath that frame, I kept a small glass case containing the rusted imprint of the key, a mold I'd cast before burying it, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Truth can corrode, but it never truly disappears. Sometimes, journalists came asking for interviews. They wanted to know how it felt. Exposing a man who had deceived the government, the family, the world. Idly. Widow. Turned whistleblower builds studio of healing. I always declined. The story they wanted wasn't mine anymore. The man they asked about no longer existed. Not legally, not morally, not in my heart. What remained of him was only a cautionary tale I used when a student hesitated to face her own locked vault. The dead don't haunt us, I'd say. The living do, especially the ones who pretend they're gone. That usually made them laugh, softly. But some understood too well. Lucas visited once a week. He worked at a small engineering firm now, one that built prosthetics for children. I never asked if it was his way of atoning. I just knew it made him gentler. He'd help me fix light fixtures, repair old cameras, keep the building's plumbing alive. Every visit, he'd bring a box of something broken, a clock, a tape recorder, a child's toy, and stay until it worked again. One afternoon, he stood by the framed photo of the grave, studying it quietly. "You really kept it," he said. "Of course. Proof is still proof, even when it's peaceful." He smiled faintly. "You ever miss him?" I paused. "The man I buried or the one I exposed?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sometimes I caught myself humming while cleaning the microscopes. That surprised me. I hadn't made sound without purpose in years. Grief, it turns out, is not something you finish. It's something you repurpose. You take the silence it leaves behind and use it as space. On the anniversary of the conference, the day the world found out who Edward Hall really was, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence, typed. Some vaults were never meant to be opened. No signature. No threat, either, just nostalgia disguised as warning. I burned it in the sink, watched the paper curl and vanish. Then I went back to class, where a woman was learning how to restore her grandmother's journal. I leaned over her shoulder, guiding her hand, teaching her how to brush the paper without tearing it. "Go slow," I said. "Truth is fragile until it's ready to speak." The students started bringing flowers sometimes, not for me, but for the photo on the wall. Lilies, daisies, wild violets. They said the grave deserved something beautiful. At first, I told them not to. The soil in the picture wasn't sacred. But then I realized it didn't matter. They weren't honoring a man. They were honoring the courage to unearth something painful and still walk away alive. That was lesson number 1 at Vault Studio. Dig carefully, but dig anyway. One rainy evening, as I was closing up, a young woman lingered by the door. She was new. Pale. Thoughtful, the kind of person who moved like she was afraid of taking up too much space. Dr. Ward? She asked. Ask you something? Of course. Are you ever afraid of cemeteries? I smiled. The question was gentle, almost naive. Oh, not anymore, I said. Why not? I looked around the room. The old walls humming softly, the restored photographs glowing under warm light, the framed grave that had become less about death and more about proof of life. Because cemeteries don't scare me, I said. Only the graves that still know how to speak. She looked puzzled, but I didn't explain. Some truths can't be taught, they have to be lived. Later that night, after everyone left, I walked along the pier behind the studio. The water reflected the city lights, trembling, imperfect, beautiful. Somewhere beneath that surface lay years of wreckage, and I finally understood that not everything submerged needed recovery. I thought about Ethan, or Edward, or whatever name he'd chosen next, if he was still alive. Maybe he'd changed his face again, started over somewhere new. Maybe he'd watched the news that day a year ago, seen me on the stage with the key, and known that his final hiding place had collapsed. If he was out there, I hoped he understood something. It didn't destroy him, I just exhumed the truth, and it buried him by itself. When I got home, I turned off the lights and stood in the mirror for a long time. My reflection didn't startle me anymore. The lines around my eyes were honest. The hair silvering at my temples was proof of survival. The woman looking back wasn't a widow or a victim or a whistleblower. She was simply someone who had learned that graves, like hearts, can be reopened. Not to mourn, but to plant something new. Vault Studio continued to grow. Women came from other towns, other lives, bringing their own versions of the buried. They learned how to handle the past like fragile evidence, to study it, label it, then release it. On the studio's door, I had a small sign engraved, Vault Studio, unlock what you buried. Every morning I touched the sign before opening the door, as if to remind myself. It wasn't a monument, it was a beginning. The studio lights are soft tonight, warm, amber, nothing like the harsh fluorescence of the morgue where I spent half my life examining the dead. In front of me is a camera. Behind it, silence. Marion set it up for me, said it might help the students. A message from the woman who turned an empty grave into a classroom. I laughed when she said that, but now, sitting here, I understand why it matters. I take a breath and look into the lens. It feels strange, addressing something that doesn't breathe back. But maybe that's what truth is. A conversation that keeps echoing, even when no one answers. If one day, I begin, voice steady, you discover that the grave in your life is empty, don't panic. I pause, letting the words settle. Maybe it isn't a curse. Maybe it's an invitation. To bury the lies that were never yours to carry and start living as someone honest again. The red recording light blinks. My reflection in the camera lens looks older, softer. I can see the silver at my temples, the lines carved by grief and weather and laughter finally earned. People ask me, I continue, how I managed to live with betrayal that long. The answer is, I didn't live with it. I embalmed it. I dressed it in flowers and called it devotion. It took me 30 years to realize, you can't resurrect love that died of deceit. You can only give it a proper burial. I glanced down at my hands. Clean now, though the memory of formalin still lingers somewhere in the skin. I used to think truth was cruel, I say quietly, that it cut deeper than any scalpel. But now I know, lies are the real autopsy. They dissect you slowly, until nothing inside belongs to you. I shift slightly, leaning closer to the lens. My voice lowers. Maybe your grave isn't a coffin. Maybe it's a marriage, a job, a secret you keep to protect someone who doesn't deserve protection. We all have one. Some of us tend it for years, bringing flowers, believing it makes us loyal. But sometimes, loyalty is just another word for slow decay. The silence after those words feels heavy, but not oppressive. Just true. So when the moment comes, when the ground cracks, when the illusion collapses, don't cover it up again. Dig deeper. Find what's still alive underneath. Because that's the part of you the lie couldn't reach. Outside, the lake wind hums against the window. I hear it, faint but constant. The same rhythm that carried me through nights of autopsy reports and missing person files. Except now it sounds less like mourning and more like movement. You don't have to build a studio, I say, smiling a little. You don't have to start over with a new name. But you can choose to stop living as someone else's ghost. I reach for the framed photo beside me. The image of the empty grave, silver lettering beneath. Here lies the truth. She dared to dig. I hold it up to the camera for a second. This, I say softly, wasn't the end of a love story. It was the start of an honest one. I set the frame back down. If you've spent years tending to something that only hurts you, maybe it's time to stop tending and start burying. Because not every grave is a tragedy. Some are proof that you finally stopped pretending the dead were still alive. The recording light flickers once, a tiny pulse in the dark. I know I should end it soon, but one more thought insists on being spoken. When I dug that grave open, I say, I thought I was searching for a man. What I found was a mirror. It showed me the woman I used to be. Patient, dutiful, blind. And for the first time, I didn't want her back. I wanted her peace. My throat tightens, but not from sadness, from release. So if you're watching this, whoever you are, whatever you've buried, I hope you find the courage to dig. Not for revenge, not for proof, but for air. Because the truth doesn't live in tombstones. It lives in the hands that dare to uncover them. I let the silence stretch a few seconds more, then lean back, exhaling. The air feels clean. Marion will edit this later, maybe trim the pauses, add subtitles. But I hope she leaves the quiet moments in. The quiet is part of the truth. I look into the lens one last time, voice calm, steady. My story closes here, but who knows? Maybe this was the first grave I ever dug with my own hands, just to bury the lies that once called themselves love.